At 1:43 a.m. on August 9, 1942, Seaman Second Class Marvin Richardson stood watch on the forward deck of the USS Astoria. He was 19 years old. He came from a small town in Kansas. He had been in the Navy for exactly 8 months. The night was black. Not dark. Black. The kind of tropical darkness where you cannot see your hand in front of your face. There was no moon. Storm clouds had rolled in over Savo Island. They blotted out even the stars. Richardson was not worried. His ship was part of the most powerful naval force ever assembled in the South Pacific. 4 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 8 destroyers, all forming a protective ring around the Marines who had just landed on Guadalcanal. The USS Astoria alone displaced 9,950 tons. She carried 9 8-inch guns. She was a New Orleans-class heavy cruiser, one of the most advanced warships in the world. Her crew had trained for years. They were professionals. Richardson yawned. It had been a long day. The landing had gone well. The Japanese had not put up much resistance. Intelligence said their nearest naval base was at Rabaul. That was 565 miles away. Even if they sortied immediately, they could not possibly arrive before dawn. He was about to light a cigarette when he saw something that made his blood freeze. Shapes, moving through the darkness, large shapes, closing fast. He grabbed the sound-powered phone. "Surface contacts! Bearing!" The night exploded. A wall of fire erupted from the darkness. Shells screamed overhead. The sound was deafening. A continuous roar of high, explosive death. Richardson watched in paralyzed horror as orange tracers arced through the blackness. Japanese shells, lit with phosphorus to help night gunnery. The first salvo hit the USS Canberra, an Australian heavy cruiser steaming 2,000 yards to his port side. Her forward turret vanished in a ball of flame. Secondary explosions tore through her superstructure. Then something hit the Astoria. The impact threw Richardson 10 feet across the deck. He scrambled to his feet. His ears were ringing. He tasted blood. More shells came. The Japanese were firing from multiple directions. How many were there? Through the smoke and flames, Richardson saw them. Japanese cruisers. Maybe 5 of them. Their pagoda-style masts silhouetted against the fires consuming the Allied ships. They were impossibly close. Less than a mile. How had they gotten so close? The Astoria tried to return fire, but her guns were pointing the wrong direction. The fire control radar was offline. The crew was scrambling. Confused, still half asleep. Another salvo hit. This one struck the bridge. The explosion killed Captain William Greenman instantly. Secondary blasts tore through the communications center. Everyone inside died. Richardson ran toward a life raft station. Around him, men were screaming. The deck was slick with blood. Fires raged, out of control. The ship was listing. Water poured in through massive holes below the waterline. He looked at his watch. It was 1:51 a.m., 8 minutes. The battle had lasted 8 minutes so far, and the USS Astoria was dying. He had no way of knowing that 3 other Allied cruisers were suffering the same fate. The USS Quincy, the USS Vincennes, HMAS Canberra. All 4 ships were burning. Sinking, dead in the water. In exactly 32 minutes, the Imperial Japanese Navy would achieve what naval historians would later call the perfect battle. The Allies would lose 1,077 sailors. 4 heavy cruisers would sink. 1 destroyer would be crippled. And the Japanese task force responsible for this carnage would vanish into the darkness as quickly as they had appeared. They would suffer minimal damage. It was the worst defeat in the history of the United States Navy. And almost nobody today has heard of it. This is the story of the Battle of Savo Island, The night the Imperial Japanese Navy executed a flawless ambush. The night the US Navy learned that technological superiority means nothing if you do not know how to use it. To understand what went wrong on that horrific night, you have to understand what was happening at Guadalcanal. August 1942 was a turning point in the Pacific War. For 8 months since Pearl Harbor, Japan had been unstoppable. They had conquered the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, dozens of Pacific islands. Their strategy was simple: create an impenetrable defensive perimeter, fortify it, force the Allies into a war of attrition they could not win. But there was one problem with this plan. Japan was overextended, their supply lines were stretched thin, and in July 1942, Allied reconnaissance planes spotted something alarming on a small jungle-covered island called Guadalcanal. The Japanese were building an airfield. This changed everything. An operational airfield on Guadalcanal would give Japanese bombers the range to hit Allied shipping lanes to Australia. They could cut off the entire South Pacific. Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations, made a decision. The Allies would invade Guadalcanal. They would seize that airfield before the Japanese could finish it. It was a massive gamble. The US military in 1942 was still building up its forces. The Marines had not conducted an opposed amphibious landing since 1898. The Navy was outnumbered in the Pacific, but King pushed it through. On August 7, 1942, the 1st Marine Division stormed the beaches of Guadalcanal. Operation Watchtower, and to everyone's shock, it worked. The Japanese garrison fled into the jungle. Most of them were construction workers, not combat troops. The Marines captured the airfield intact. By nightfall on August 7th, 11,000 Marines were ashore. The Allied naval commanders were euphoric. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner commanded the amphibious force. He believed the hard part was over. Now they just had to unload supplies and protect the transports. To do this, Turner assembled a powerful screening force. He divided his ships into 3 groups: Southern Force, 2 Australian cruisers, HMAS Australia and HMAS Canberra, plus USS Chicago and 2 destroyers. They patrolled south of Savo Island. Northern Force, 3 U.S. heavy cruisers, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, USS Quincy, plus 2 destroyers. They patrolled north of Savo Island. Eastern Force, 2 light cruisers and transports, staying near Guadalcanal. The plan was simple. Any Japanese force trying to reach the transports would have to pass through the sound between Savo Island and Guadalcanal. The Allied cruisers would intercept them with overwhelming firepower. On paper, it was a solid plan, but there were warning signs that something was terribly wrong. First, the commander of the screening force was not even with his ships. British Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley had been called to a meeting with Turner. He took his flagship, HMAS Australia, with him. Second, the screening force commanders did not know each other well. Some had never worked together before. There was no unified battle plan. Third, the crews were exhausted. They had been at battle stations for 2 days straight during the landing. Many sailors were asleep at their posts, including officers. Fourth, Admiral Turner had received a reconnaissance report at 6 p.m. on August 8th. An Australian coast watcher had spotted a Japanese force, cruisers and destroyers, heading southeast from Rabaul. Turner dismissed it. He calculated that even if the Japanese were coming, they could not possibly arrive before dawn. And everyone knew the Japanese did not like to fight at night. Everyone was wrong. What the Allies did not understand was that the Imperial Japanese Navy had spent the entire interwar period perfecting one specific tactical doctrine: night surface combat. While the U.S. Navy focused on carrier aviation and battleship gunnery, The Japanese trained obsessively for night battles. They developed tactics, equipment, a warrior culture around fighting in total darkness. Their secret weapon was not technological superiority. It was training and doctrine. Let me explain their advantages. First, optics. Japanese cruisers were equipped with massive, high-quality optical rangefinders. These devices were over 30 feet long. They allowed trained observers to spot enemy ships in near-total darkness. American fire control radar in 1942 was primitive, unreliable. The Japanese did not need it. Their eyes were better. Second, the Long Lance torpedo. The Type 93 Long Lance torpedo was the most advanced naval weapon in the world. It had a range of 20 miles at 48 knots. U.S. torpedoes had a 4.5-mile range at 27 knots. The Long Lance used pure oxygen propulsion. It left no visible wake. It was a silent, invisible ship killer. Third, tactical doctrine. Japanese cruiser captains practiced night gunnery until it became instinct. They drilled in pitch blackness. They learned to recognize ship silhouettes by feel. They trained to fire first, fire fast, maneuver aggressively. Fourth, communication. Japanese ships used signal lamps and prearranged tactical plans. They did not need to break radio silence. Allied ships relied on radio communication. That could be jammed or intercepted. The man commanding the Japanese task force heading toward Guadalcanal understood all of this intimately. Vice Admiral Mikawa was 53 years old, a career naval officer. He had commanded cruisers for over a decade. When he received word that the Americans had landed on Guadalcanal, he did not hesitate. He gathered every available warship at Rabaul: 5 heavy cruisers, Chokai, Aoba, Kako, Kinugasa, Furutaka, 2 light cruisers, Tenryu, Yubari, 1 destroyer, Unagi. It was not a massive force. Just 8 ships, but Mikawa had 2 advantages: surprise and darkness. He planned his approach carefully. His ships would sail south through the slot between the Solomon Islands, a route the Allies were not watching carefully. They would arrive after midnight, attack at maximum speed, withdraw before dawn. Mikawa's orders to his captains were brutally simple. We will penetrate and destroy the enemy. Every ship will fight to the death. The Japanese fleet left Rabaul at noon on August 8th. They steamed south at 24 knots. The crews were at battle stations, every eye scanning the horizon. At 10:30 a.m., an Australian Hudson bomber spotted them. The pilot radioed a report: 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, 2 seaplane tenders, heading southeast. But the report was garbled. By the time it reached Admiral Turner, it was too late to matter. He still believed the Japanese could not arrive before dawn. At 6:14 p.m., Mikawa's force was spotted again by another patrol plane. This pilot correctly identified 5 cruisers. He radioed his report. It never reached Turner. Communication failures, message delays, assumptions about Japanese intentions. The Allied commanders went to sleep believing they were safe. They were not. At midnight, Mikawa's ships passed within sight of the USS Blue, an American destroyer on radar picket duty. The Blue's radar operator saw contacts, but he dismissed them as friendly ships. He did not sound the alarm. The Japanese were now inside the Allied defensive perimeter. Mikawa stood on the bridge of his flagship, the heavy cruiser Chokai. Through his optical rangefinder, he could see the silhouettes of Allied ships. They were stationary. No evasive maneuvers. Many had their lights on. Mikawa could not believe his luck. He gave the order: All ships attack. At 1:36 a.m., the Japanese task force split into two columns. The plan was to execute a classic pincer movement. One column would attack the southern force, the other would hit the northern force. They would trap the Allies in a crossfire. Mikawa's ships increased speed to 30 knots, the maximum speed their oldest cruiser could sustain. On the bridge of HMAS Canberra, Captain Frank Getting was reviewing patrol reports when lookouts spotted shapes in the darkness. Before he could react, the Japanese opened fire. The first salvo was perfect. 24 8-inch shells slammed into the Canberra in less than 30 seconds. One shell penetrated the boiler room. Superheated steam killed everyone inside instantly. Another shell hit the bridge. Captain Getting was mortally wounded. He would die 4 days later without regaining consciousness. The Canberra's engines were destroyed. She was dead in the water, burning. Her crew abandoned ship at 2:15 a.m. She would be scuttled later that morning. The USS Chicago was next in line. She took a torpedo hit to her bow. It blew off 60 feet of her forward section. But her captain, Howard Bode, made a catastrophic decision. Instead of alerting the northern force by radio, he turned south, away from the battle. He later claimed he was pursuing Japanese destroyers. He was not. He was retreating. Captain Bode's failure to warn the northern force meant that 3 U.S. heavy cruisers were about to be ambushed with no warning whatsoever. The USS Vincennes, the USS Astoria, the USS Quincy. They were steaming in a lazy patrol pattern. Most of their crews were asleep. At 1:43 a.m., Japanese searchlights snapped on. The 3 cruisers were bathed in blinding white light. It was like standing on a stage under spotlights. They could not see anything beyond the glare, but the Japanese could see them perfectly. What followed was not a battle. It was an execution. The Japanese opened fire from 3 sides simultaneously. They had achieved the perfect T-crossing maneuver. Every gun on every Japanese ship could fire. The American ships could only fire their forward turrets. The USS Vincennes was hit first. Captain Frederick Reefcoal was asleep in his sea cabin when the first shells hit. He rushed to the bridge in his pajamas. By the time he arrived, his ship was already dying. Japanese shells tore through the Vincennes with horrifying efficiency. One shell hit the fire control center. It killed everyone inside. Another shell penetrated the forward magazine. The resulting explosion lifted the bow of the ship 10 feet out of the water. Captain Reefcoal tried to return fire, but the Vincennes' guns could not find targets. The searchlights were blinding. The fire control radar was destroyed. At 1:55 a.m., a Japanese torpedo struck the Vincennes amidships. The explosion broke her keel. She began to sink. Captain Reefcoal gave the order to abandon ship at 2:05 a.m. The Vincennes capsized and sank at 2:50 a.m. She took 332 men with her. The USS Astoria fared no better. We already know what happened to Seaman Richardson. But let me tell you about the officers. Captain William Greenman was killed in the first minutes of the battle. Executive Officer Commander John Hayes assumed command. Hayes was a by-the-book officer. He ordered damage control parties to fight the fires. He tried to get the engines restarted, but it was hopeless. The Astoria had taken at least 65 direct hits. Her superstructure was a twisted wreck. Fires raged out of control. Her steering was gone. At 4:30 a.m., Commander Hayes was forced to give the order he had prayed he would never give. Abandon ship. The Astoria stayed afloat until 12:16 p.m. on August 9th. Then she rolled over and sank. 216 men died with her. The USS Quincy suffered the worst fate of all. Captain Samuel Moore had just reached the bridge when the Japanese opened fire. He immediately ordered general quarters. battle stations. But it was too late. The Quincy was caught in a murderous crossfire. Japanese ships were firing from port and starboard simultaneously. Within 2 minutes, the Quincy had been hit by over 50 shells. One shell struck the bridge. It killed Captain Moore and most of his staff instantly. Another shell hit the pilot house. The helmsman was killed. The ship lost all steering control. The Quincy began to circle aimlessly, burning, out of control. Japanese gunners saw this and concentrated their fire. They poured shells into the helpless cruiser. At 1:58 am, the Quincy's forward magazines exploded. The blast tore the ship in half. She sank at 2:35 am. 370 men went down with her. In 32 minutes, the Imperial Japanese Navy had sunk 4 Allied heavy cruisers. It was the most one-sided naval battle since the Spanish Armada. But here is the part that historians still debate today. Admiral Mikawa had achieved total victory. The Allied screening force was destroyed. Nothing stood between his ships and the defenseless transports sitting off Guadalcanal. Those transports were packed with supplies, ammunition, food, medical equipment, everything the Marines needed to hold the island. Mikawa could have sailed into the transport area and destroyed every ship there. He could have crippled the entire Guadalcanal campaign, but he did not. At 2:16 am, Admiral Mikawa gave the order to withdraw. Why? His official reason was concern about American carrier-based aircraft. He knew there were U.S. carriers somewhere in the region. He did not want to be caught in daylight. But many historians believe the real reason was different. Mikawa was a cruiser admiral. He had spent his entire career commanding surface ships. He understood surface combat. But he did not understand amphibious operations. He did not realize how vulnerable the transports were. He did not grasp the strategic opportunity in front of him. So he withdrew. His ships turned north. They steamed back through the slot at high speed. By dawn, they were 200 miles away. The Allies had been saved by their enemy's caution, but the cost had been staggering. As the sun rose on August 9th, the full scope of the disaster became clear. 4 heavy cruisers sunk, 1,077 Allied sailors dead, over 700 wounded. The burning wrecks of the Vincennes, Astoria, and Quincy littered the waters off Savo Island. The Canberra was scuttled by American destroyers to prevent her capture. It was the worst surface action defeat in U.S. Navy history. Admiral Turner immediately ordered the surviving transports to withdraw. The Marines on Guadalcanal were left stranded with only half their supplies unloaded. The recriminations began immediately. Admiral Turner blamed the screening force commanders for poor coordination. The screening force commanders blamed Turner for inadequate intelligence. Everyone blamed the radar operators for not detecting the Japanese earlier, but the real culprit was deeper than individual mistakes. The U.S. Navy in 1942 was simply not prepared for night surface combat. They had the ships, they had the technology, but they did not have the doctrine, the training, the experience. The Japanese had spent 20 years perfecting night fighting. The Americans were learning on the job, and the tuition was paid in blood. Captain Howard Bode of the USS Chicago became the focus of particular anger. His failure to warn the Northern force had directly led to the ambush. In April 1943, facing a formal inquiry, Bode walked into his brother's backyard in San Francisco and shot himself in the head. He left a note. "I am unable to shake the charge that I failed in my duty." The Battle of Savo Island was hushed up by the U.S. government. Details were classified. The press was not given the full story. The American public was told only that some ships had been lost in action near Guadalcanal. The full truth did not emerge until after the war. But while the battle was hidden from the public, the U.S. Navy learned its lessons immediately. New doctrines were written. Night combat training became mandatory. Ships were equipped with better radar, better communication systems, better searchlights. Fire control procedures were completely overhauled. Cruiser captains were trained in aggressive night tactics. Radar operators learned to trust their screens, even when visual contact was unclear. The Navy also learned a painful lesson about command and control. Never again would a screening force commander be called away from his ships during combat operations. Never again would cruisers patrol without a unified battle plan. Most importantly, the Navy learned to respect the enemy. American intelligence had consistently underestimated Japanese night fighting capabilities. They assumed American technology would make up for any tactical shortcomings. Savo Island proved that assumptions get men killed. By 1944, the U.S. Navy had become the most effective night fighting force in the world. They won crushing victories at Cape Esperance, Guadalcanal, Tassafaronga, Empress Augusta Bay. They learned from their defeat. But the victory came too late for the 1,077 men who died in those 32 minutes off Savo Island. As for the Japanese, their victory was Pyrrhic. Admiral Mikawa's decision to withdraw meant the transport survived. The Marines held Guadalcanal. The airfield was renamed Henderson Field. And from that airfield, American planes would eventually strangle Japanese supply lines to the entire Solomon Islands. Strategically, Savo Island changed nothing. Tactically, it changed everything. One more footnote to this story. Remember the heavy cruiser Kako, one of Mikawa's ships? On August 10th, while returning to Rabaul, the Kako was torpedoed by the American submarine USS S-44. She sank with heavy loss of life. The U.S. Navy had drawn first blood in revenge. Today, the wrecks of the Vincennes, Astoria, Quincy, and Canberra still rest on the bottom of what sailors now call Iron Bottom Sound. More than 60 ships sank in those waters during the Guadalcanal campaign. It is one of the largest ship graveyards in the world. The site is protected. Divers are not allowed to disturb the wrecks. They are considered war graves. Every year, a handful of U.S. Navy and Royal Australian Navy ships visit the site. They conduct memorial ceremonies. Sailors drop wreaths into the water above the wrecks, honoring the men who died in the worst night in Allied naval history. The Battle of Savo Island is often overshadowed by more famous naval battles. Midway, Later Gulf, the Coral Sea. But for the men who were there, it was the battle that defined their war. And for the U.S. Navy, it was the night they learned that courage means nothing without competence. That technology means nothing without training. That arrogance means nothing when facing a skilled and determined enemy. The Japanese executed the perfect battle, and the Allies learned the perfect lesson. Never underestimate your enemy, never assume the fight will be easy, and never send men into combat without giving them every tool, every skill, every advantage they need to survive. That lesson cost 1,077 lives, but it helped win the war.